December 14, 1856, Concordia Parish, Louisiana. The air hung thick with the rot of sugar cane and something darker, something that had been fermenting in the blood-soaked soil of the South for generations. On the Terrell plantation, just beneath a sky bruised violet by the dying light of winter dusk, 12 white overseers circled a single black man like wolves testing the edges of a bear's den. His name was Jacob Terrell, suggests, though the plantation ledgers recorded him only as property, 6 feet 4 inches muscle sinew and something the slaveholders had no word for, unbreakable will. Tonight, the mathematics of bondage would be tested. Tonight, 12 armed men would learn that some spirits cannot be chained, some bodies will not bow, and some reckonings arrive not with thunder, but with the quiet, terrible certainty of a storm that has been gathering for 32 years. Suggests this was not the first time Jacob had been called unmanageable. The overseers had whispered it. The neighboring planters had heard rumors of him. The enslaved man who could lift a plow horse, suggests, who once carried a fallen oak across his shoulders to clear a road after a storm, who worked twice as hard as any man yet somehow retained a light in his eyes that slavery was designed to extinguish. Suggest, but strength alone was not Jacob's sin in their eyes. It was defiance wrapped in obedience, dignity cloaked in compliance. He never ran, he never struck first. But when they came for his wife, when Overseer Matthias Crane decided that Sarah Terrell, 7 months swollen with child, would be disciplined for the crime of exhaustion, Jacob did what no system of bondage could tolerate. He said no. Not with words, with his body. He stepped between Crane's whip and Sarah's back, and in that single motion he became something more dangerous than a rebel. He became a symbol, and symbols in the South of 1856 had to be destroyed. What happened next would not be recorded in any official history, but it would be whispered in the quarters, sung in coded spirituals, and passed down through generations as a story of when one man's body became a battleground between human will and inhuman law. This is not a story with a happy ending. History rarely offers those to the righteous, jests. But it is a story that must be told because legends are born not in comfort, but in the crucible of impossible resistance. If you believe that some stories deserve to survive the silence that tries to bury them, then stay with this one, share it. Just let it burn in your memory the way it burned in the winter air of Concordia Parish. Because what 12 overseers tried to do to Jacob Terrell that night was erase him. And what you're about to witness is why they failed. Jacob Terrell was born in 1824, not on the Terrell plantation but on a smaller farm in northern Mississippi where his mother, Dina, served as a midwife, and his father, whose name was never recorded, disappeared into the coffles headed south when Jacob was still learning to walk. Dinah told him only one thing about the man: he was strong, suggests, but strength without wisdom is just another tool for them to use. Jacob carried those words like a second heartbeat. By the age of 12 he was already taller than most grown men, just his hands capable of cracking walnuts between thumb and forefinger, his back broad enough to carry cotton bales that required 2 men to lift. The slaveholder who owned him then, a man named Corwin, recognized value when he saw it and sold Jacob south to Louisiana at auction in 1840 for $1,200, a price that made the other bidders whistle low and shake their heads. The Terrell family, suggests, wealthy sugar planters with 3,000 acres and 200 enslaved people, bought him for his body. They never anticipated his mind. For 16 years, Jacob worked the cane fields during harvest season, repaired levees when the Mississippi threatened to swallow the land, and built the very quarters in which he and the other enslaved lived. He watched children sold away from mothers. He watched men beaten to death for looking white overseers in the eye. He watched women taken into the big house and return hollow-eyed at dawn. And through it all, he perfected a kind of invisible resistance, working hard enough to avoid the lash but never so hard that it raised expectations, speaking softly enough to avoid confrontation but never so meekly that it suggested fear. He married Sarah in 1853, a woman who had been born on the Terrell plantation and whose laughter, rare and bright as a cardinal in winter, was the only beauty slavery had not yet stolen from his world. When she became pregnant in the summer of 1856, Jacob made a quiet, secret vow that no child of his would inherit his chains. He didn't yet know how. He only knew that something inside him, something ancient and immovable, had begun to shift. The Terrell plantation in 1856 was a kingdom of cruelty masquerading as civilization. The big house rose 3 stories high, white columns gleaming like bleached bones against the Louisiana sky, its verandas wrapped in ironwork imported from France, its parlors filled with furniture carved from mahogany harvested by hands that would never sit upon it. Master Edmund Terrell, 53 years old, considered himself a benevolent slaveholder, a phrase he used often at dinner parties in New Orleans, where he sipped bourbon and debated politics with men who measured their wealth in human flesh. He allowed his enslaved people to marry, suggests, to keep small garden plots, to gather for worship on Sunday evenings under the supervision of a white preacher who spoke endlessly of obedience, humility, and the divine order that placed some men in chains and others in parlors. Edmund Terrell believed he was kind. He had never personally wielded a whip. He left that to his overseers, 12 white men who lived in cabins along the plantation's perimeter, men whose wages depended on productivity, suggests on the amount of sugar cane cut and processed, on keeping the labor force compliant and terrified. Matthias Crane was the worst of them, 38 years old, lean as a whip handle himself, with eyes the color of dirty ice and a smile that never reached them. He had come to Louisiana from Georgia, fleeing rumors of a murder that was never quite proven, and he brought with him a philosophy, jests. Enslaved people were animals that needed breaking, and the best way to break them was through their loved ones. He had beaten men in front of their wives, whipped women in front of their children, jests, and sold infants away from mothers while the ink was still wet on the bills of sale. The other overseers feared him. The enslaved people hated him with a purity that transcended words. And when Sarah Terrell, jests, 7 months pregnant and struggling through the October heat, collapsed in the cane fields on December 13th, it was Matthias Crane who stood over her with a leather strap in his hand and decided that her exhaustion was insubordination. Her weakness was defiance and her body was his to discipline. Jacob was repairing a broken wheel on a cane cart when he heard Sarah scream. It was not the scream of surprise or sudden pain. It was the sound of a soul being torn, jests, a guttural cry that carried across the fields and stopped every hand mid-motion, every heart mid-beat. He dropped the tools and ran, his bare feet pounding the dirt path between the cane rows, his mind already knowing what his heart refused to accept. When he broke through the stalks into the clearing, he saw her on her knees, Matthias Crane standing above her with the strap raised, 3 other overseers standing in a loose semicircle, watching. Sarah's dress was torn at the shoulder. Blood trickled from her lip. Her hands were wrapped protectively around her swollen belly, and her eyes, when they met Jacob's, held not fear but a terrible, quiet plea. Don't. They'll kill you. Matthias Crane saw Jacob and smiled. This your woman, boy? He didn't wait for an answer. She needs to learn that when I say work, she works. Baby or no baby, she's property. Suggests and property don't get to decide when it's tired. He raised the strap again. The leather whistled as it cut the air. And Jacob moved, not with thought, not with calculation, suggests, with something deeper than consciousness. With the accumulated weight of 32 years of swallowed rage, inherited trauma, and love that had nowhere to go but into his body, suggests, he crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and caught Matthias Crane's wrist mid-swing. The overseer's smile vanished. Jacob's grip was iron. The bones in Crane's wrist ground together, and the strap fell from suddenly nerveless fingers. No, Jacob said. Just that one word, quiet, certain, final. It hung in the air like a declaration of war. The other 3 overseers reached for their weapons, cudgels, a pistol, a coiled whip, suggests. Matthias Crane's face went purple with fury and something else, something he would never admit, fear. You just signed your death warrant, boy, he hissed. Jacob didn't let go, maybe, he said. But not hers. Within 30 minutes, the entire architecture of plantation authority had mobilized against one man. Matthias Crane, his wrist swelling purple and his pride shattered before the other overseers, sent a runner to the big house and jaw-wanned every white man within riding distance. They came like carrion birds to a carcass, overseers from the neighboring plantations, poor whites who worked as patrollers. Suggest even 2 men from the town of Vidalia who served as constables and saw in this moment an opportunity to remind the enslaved population what happened when the natural order was challenged. By the time the sun had fully set, Chick's 12 men stood in a circle around Jacob Terrell in the open space between the quarters and the sugar mill. They brought chains, they brought rope, they brought a branding iron that glowed red in a hastily built fire, jests. Because Matthias Crane wanted more than punishment. He wanted spectacle, wanted every enslaved person on the Terrell plantation and beyond to see what happened when you touched a white man, when you said no, when you forgot your place. Jacob had sent Sarah away. She had begged him to run, to disappear into the swamps where the Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds and the water moccasins slithered through blue-black water, but he refused. I run, they take it out on you. On the baby. On everyone here. His voice had been steady, almost gentle. I stay, I face it, maybe it ends with me. She had kissed him then, her tears hot against his neck, and whispered words he would carry into what came next. Jets. You are the strongest man I've ever known. Not your body, your heart. Now she watched from the doorway of their cabin with 50 other enslaved people. Their faces carved from shadow and firelight, their silence more eloquent than any scream. The 12 white men studied Jacob like a problem to be solved. He stood in the center of their circle, arms at his sides, breathing steady, 6'4". 240 pounds of muscle earned through unrelenting labor, suggests. His eyes moved from face to face, memorizing each one, and in that gaze was something that made even the bravest among them shift uncomfortably. He was not afraid, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. Matthias Crane spoke first, suggests, his voice carrying the forced authority of a man trying to reassert dominance he'd already lost. Chain him. Hands and feet. Then we'll see how strong he thinks he is. 4 overseers moved forward. Silas Drummond, a thick-necked man from Virginia, jests. Patrick Yates, young and eager to prove himself. Charles Odom, who had worked the Terrell plantation for 8 years and prided himself on never showing mercy, and Thomas Guidry, a Creole man whose presence in their ranks was tolerated only because he hated the enslaved as much as any white overseer. They carried heavy iron shackles, the kind used on the coffles that marched human cargo from the auction blocks to the fields. Metal worn smooth by the wrists and ankles of 1,000 desperate souls. Jacob watched them come. He did not move, did not speak. His stillness was unnerving, like watching a mountain decide whether to fall. Silas Drummond reached him first and grabbed for Jacob's right wrist. What happened next would be debated in whispers for generations. Jacob didn't strike him, not at first. He simply pulled his arm back, suggest a motion so economical and controlled it seemed effortless, and Silas Drummond, who weighed 200 pounds himself, was yanked forward like a child. He stumbled, crashed into Patrick Yates, and both men went down in a tangle of limbs and cursing. Charles Odom swung a cudgel at Jacob's head. Jacob caught it mid-swing with his left hand, his fingers wrapping around the wood, and squeezed. The cudgel, solid hickory, cracked lengthwise with a sound like a gunshot. Odom stared at the splintered weapon in disbelief. Thomas Guidry lunged low, trying to tackle Jacob at the knees, and Jacob pivoted, just pivoted, and Guidry sailed past him, chest's crashing face first into the dirt. 4 men, 4 seconds, 4 failures. The circle of overseers went quiet. Somewhere in the watching crowd of enslaved people, someone exhaled a breath they didn't know they'd been holding. Jacob stood exactly where he'd started, his chest rising and falling slowly, his eyes still moving from face to face. "I don't want to hurt nobody," he said quietly, suggests. "But I ain't letting you chain me." Matthias Crane's face had gone from purple to white, the color of a man watching his entire worldview collapse. Suggests he pulled a pistol from his belt, the .44 caliber revolver that gleamed dully in the firelight, and leveled it at Jacob's chest. "You think your nigger strength means anything against this?" His hand trembled. Suggests not from fear but from rage so pure it had nowhere to go but into his trigger finger. The other overseers drew their weapons now, 2-3 more pistols, 2 rifles, a shotgun loaded with buckshot that could tear a man in half at close range. Jests. 9 guns pointed at one unarmed man. The mathematics should have been simple, should have been final. But Jacob Terrell did something that broke every rule of survival the enslaved had learned. He laughed. Not loud, not mocking. A low, rumbling sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest, a laugh that acknowledged the absurdity, the cosmic injustice. Just the sheer desperate terror of 12 armed men facing one man whose only weapons were his body and his refusal to be afraid anymore. "You gon' shoot me in front of all these witnesses?" Jacob asked, his voice carrying across the clearing. "In front of Master Terrell's property. You know what a bullet hole does to resale value. It was a calculated risk, speaking economic language to men whose livelihoods depended on preserving capital." Edmund Terrell suggests, watching from the veranda of the big house with a glass of brandy in his hand. "Called out, Crane!" "No shooting unless absolutely necessary. He's worth $1,500 on the block." Matthias Crane's jaw clenched so hard his teeth should have shattered. He lowered the pistol but didn't holster it. "Fine. We do this the old way." He nodded to the remaining overseers who hadn't yet tried to restrain Jacob. "All of us, at once. Rush him, bring him down. I don't care if we break every bone in his body, just get him on the ground." The 8 men prepared to charge. Jacob widened his stance, lowered his center of gravity, and did something that would be remembered forever. He smiled. Not with joy. With certainty. The certainty of a man who had already decided that if he was going down, he was taking their dignity with him. They came at him like a wave breaking against stone. 8 white men, some weighing over 200 pounds, suggest moving with the practiced coordination of men who had spent years subduing human beings for profit. Silas Drummond and Patrick Yates from the left, Charles Odom and Thomas Guidry from the right, jests. 4 more, men whose names would be lost to history but whose violence would not, from the front and rear. 12 men total now, a dozen instruments of a system designed to crush resistance before it could become rebellion, jests. They crashed into Jacob Terrell with the force of a battering ram, and for a moment, just one suspended, breathless moment, it seemed the laws of physics would prevail, that mass and momentum would do what authority could not, jests. But Jacob did not fall. His legs, thick as oak trunks from decades of labor that would have killed weaker men, absorbed the impact. His back, scarred from whippings he'd endured in silence, bent but did not break. His arms, which had lifted hogsheads of sugar weighing 600 pounds, wrapped around the nearest bodies and squeezed. Silas Drummond screamed as his ribs compressed. Patrick Yates clawed at Jacob's face, his fingernails drawing blood. But Jacob shook him off like a dog shaking water. Charles Odom tried to wrap a chain around Jacob's neck from behind, but Jacob reached back with one hand, grabbed Odom by the collar, and threw him, 6 feet through the air. Odom landed in the fire pit, scattering embers and adding his screams to the chaos. The watching enslaved people stood frozen, caught between terror and something they had no language for, hope. Because what they were witnessing was impossible. The overseers were tangled around Jacob like snakes trying to strangle a bear, and the bear was still standing, still fighting, still winning. Thomas Guidry bit Jacob's shoulder hard enough to draw blood. Jacob headbutted him so hard Guidry's nose shattered audibly and he dropped like a stone. 4 men down, 8 still clinging to Jacob's body, and somewhere in the night a mockingbird sang, oblivious to the fact that the world was changing. For 7 minutes, 7 eternal minutes that would be recounted in quarters from Louisiana to Mississippi to Alabama, Jacob Terrell fought 12 white men and did not fall. He bled from a dozen wounds. His left eye swelled shut from a cudgel blow that would have knocked an ordinary man unconscious. His back burned where someone had pressed a lit torch against his shirt until the fabric smoldered and his skin blistered. But his feet remained planted in the Louisiana dirt as if he'd grown roots, as if some ancestral power had traveled up through the soil that had drunk the sweat and blood of his people, and was now lending him its strength. He threw men off his body the way a bull throws riders. He broke a man's arm with a grip that crushed bone through muscle. He caught a knife thrust aimed at his belly and twisted the blade away, the edge slicing his palm open but the weapon clattering harmlessly to the ground. Matthias Crane, watching his carefully constructed authority dissolve, did what desperate men always do. He abandoned principle for expedience. Shoot him, he screamed. I don't care what Terrell says, shoot him now. But the overseers with guns couldn't get a clear shot, not with their own men wrapped around Jacob like a second skin, not with bodies surging and falling in the firelight's chaotic dance. And Jacob, bleeding, burning, surrounded, did something that transcended tactics and entered the realm of legend. He began to sing, his voice deep and resonant, cut through the grunting and cursing and the wet sounds of fists meeting flesh. Wade in the water, children, wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. It was a spiritual the enslaved sang in secret, a song about Moses and freedom and rivers that could wash away chains. But Jacob sang it like a war chant, like a promise, like a prophecy. And as he sang, something shifted in the watching crowd. Backs straightened, chins lifted, eyes that had been dulled by years of degradation, suddenly burned with something slaveholders feared more than any rebellion, collective recognition that the chains were only as strong as their willingness to wear them. Edmund Terrell descended from his veranda, his face ashen, his brandy glass forgotten on the railing. What he witnessed was not merely a physical struggle, it was an ideological catastrophe. The entire premise of slavery rested on the assumption of absolute control, the unquestionable superiority of white authority, the inevitable submission of black bodies to white will. And here, in front of 200 enslaved witnesses, that premise was being destroyed by one man who refused to accept the role history had assigned him. Terrell understood what Matthias Crane in his rage could not, that Jacob's continued resistance was more dangerous than any slave revolt suggests, because revolts could be crushed and forgotten, but legends lived forever in the minds of the oppressed, breeding dreams of liberation that no amount of violence could fully extinguish. Enough! Terrell's voice cracked like a whip across the clearing. Stand down! All of you stand back! The overseers, exhausted and bloodied, staggered away from Jacob like defeated soldiers retreating from an unwinnable battle. Jacob stood in the center of the circle, swaying slightly now, his body finally acknowledging the toll of the fight. Blood ran from cuts on his face, his arms, his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he was standing. Still standing. The ground around him was littered with broken weapons, torn clothing, and the dignity of 12 white men who would never again walk through the quarters without remembering this night, without feeling the ghost of their own inadequacy. Matthias Crane spat blood into the dirt. He has to pay for this. We can't let him. Terrell interrupted coldly. But not here. Not like this. He turned to face Jacob, and in his eyes was something more dangerous than Crane's rage calculation. Jacob Terrell, you have assaulted white men. You have disrupted the order of this plantation. You have become a liability I cannot afford. He paused, letting the words settle like a death sentence. At dawn you will be sold, taken from this plantation, from your wife, from everything you know, and where you're going. His smile was thin and cruel. Strength won't save you. Nothing will. They locked Jacob in the sugar mill, chained him to an iron ring embedded in the stone wall, not because they believed the chains would hold him, but because ritual demanded it, because the performance of control mattered even when control itself had been exposed as illusion. 2 armed guards stood outside the door. Men brought in from Vidalia who hadn't witnessed the fight and therefore still believed in their own authority. Inside, in the darkness that smelled of molasses and old sweat, Jacob sat with his back against the cold stone and let his body catalog its injuries. Broken ribs on the left side, deep bruising across his shoulders and spine, the burn on his back that would scar in the shape of a torch's flame. His hands, swollen and split at the knuckles, trembled now that the adrenaline had drained away. He was 32 years old, and he had just signed away whatever future he might have imagined. But Sarah came to him anyway. The guards let her pass, A small mercy or perhaps a calculated cruelty allowing them one final goodbye. She carried a cloth soaked in cool water, a tin cup of whiskey stolen from the overseer's stores, and a determination in her eyes that matched his own. She cleaned his wounds without speaking, her hands gentle but efficient, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "They're saying you fought like a man possessed. Just that it took 12 of them and they still couldn't bring you down." Jacob tried to smile, but his split lip made it painful. Didn't feel like winning. It was, Sarah insisted. She placed her hand over his chests, her fingers intertwining with his despite the blood and the swelling. "Every child in these quarters saw what you did tonight. Every woman, every man. They saw that we're not what they tell us we are, that we're human."
"That we can fight, and now I pay for it?"
Jacob said quietly. "Tomorrow they sell me south, deep south, probably, Alabama, Mississippi, some place where they break men like me for sport." Sarah's other hand moved to her belly, where their child grew in defiance of a world that would try to claim it as property before it drew its first breath. "Then you make them remember," Sarah whispered, her voice fierce now, jests, filled with a fire that matched the one that had burned in Jacob all his life. "Every plantation they send you to, every chain they wrap around you, every white man who thinks he can break you. You show them what you showed those 12 tonight. Not because it'll save you, because it has to be done, because somebody has to stand, Jacob. Somebody has to look them in their eyes and say no and mean it, even if it costs everything." Tears ran down her face now, cutting tracks through the dust and sorrow. "This baby," she pressed his hand harder against her belly, "this baby is going to be born into the same hell we were born into. But when they're old enough to understand, I'm going to tell them about their father, about the night 12 white men couldn't bring him down, about the man who loved me enough to risk everything for my dignity, about the legend." Jacob pulled her close with his chained hands, suggests, the iron links clinking softly, and kissed her forehead. "You name that baby Freedom," he said. "Boy or girl, don't matter. You name them Freedom and you tell them why. Tell them their daddy didn't win, but he didn't surrender either. Tell them there's a difference." They sat together until the moon reached its apex, until the guards outside grew restless and called through the door that her time was up. Before she left, jests, Sarah reached into her dress and pulled out something small wrapped in cloth, a piece of the broken cudgel from the fight, the one Jacob had shattered with his bare hand. "I took this," she said. "I'm going to keep it, going to pass it down. So there's proof. So nobody can say it didn't happen." When she was gone, Jacob closed his eyes and did not sleep. He thought about his mother's words from decades ago: strength without wisdom is just another tool for them to use. Maybe she was right. Maybe his strength had only ever been another form of bondage. But tonight, for 7 impossible minutes, it had been his own. Pause here, for just a moment, and understand what you're witnessing. This is not entertainment. This is not a fable designed to comfort you with easy morals and happy endings. This is the story of a man who stood against an empire built on brutality, who fought 12 armed overseers with nothing but his body and his refusal to be broken, to jests, and who knew, even as he fought, that the cost would be everything he loved. These stories don't survive by accident. They survive because people like you choose to remember them, to share them, to carry them forward into a world that would prefer they stay buried. If this story has reached something in you, if Jacob's stand means anything at all, then don't let it end here. Subscribe, comment, suggest, share this with someone who needs to know that resistance, even doomed resistance, matters. Because legends aren't born in victory, they're born in the refusal to surrender. December 15th, 1856. Dawn arrived cold and merciless, the sun bleeding red through morning fog that clung to the Mississippi River like guilt. Jacob was dragged from the sugar mill in chains, heavy iron cuffs on his wrists and ankles, connected by links thick enough to moor a ship, and loaded onto a wagon that would carry him to the Vidalia auction house. Matthias Crane watched from a distance, his right wrist wrapped in bandages, his face still carrying the bruises of humiliation. He wanted to be there when Jacob was sold, wanted to see the moment when this man who had defied him was reduced once again to property, to a line item in a ledger, to proof that the system always won in the end. 200 enslaved people from the Terrell plantation lined the road as the wagon passed, their faces stone, their silence deafening. They did not wave goodbye. They did not weep openly, though tears ran down many faces. They simply bore witness, an act of rebellion in itself, standing as living proof that what happened the night before had been real, had mattered, jests, had changed something fundamental in how they understood their own capacity for resistance. Sarah stood at the front of the crowd, her hand resting on her belly, her eyes locked on Jacob's face. He looked back at her. Jests, and that gaze was everything they could not say, "I love you."
"I'm sorry." "Be strong, Salif. Tell our child."
"Remember." The wagon rolled past her, the wheels creaking. The driver, a white man named Hoskins, who did this work for $20 a trip, whistling a tune as if he were transporting lumber instead of a human being whose world was being torn apart. Jests. Jacob never looked away from Sarah until distance and fog made it impossible to see her anymore. Then he turned his eyes forward, toward whatever hell waited for him in the deep south, and he began to sing again, his voice carrying back across the fields. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, troubles of the world, troubles of the world. Soon I will be done with the troubles of the world, says going home to live with God. The Vidalia auction house was a converted tobacco warehouse on the waterfront, its floors stained dark with decades of spilled tobacco juice and human misery. By 9 o'clock in the morning, 30 potential buyers had gathered, plantation owners from across Louisiana and Mississippi, speculators who bought enslaved people in bulk and resold them for profit, suggests in one particularly cruel man named Hiram Blackwood who owned a turpentine camp in the Alabama pine forests where enslaved laborers were worked to death in an average of 7 years. Blackwood had a reputation for buying problem slaves, men who had resisted, who had fought back, who carried scars of rebellion on their bodies and in their spirits. He broke them. Not quickly because that served no purpose, but methodically, jests, stripping away their humanity piece by piece until they became the obedient tools the system demanded. When Jacob was led onto the auction block, still chained, still carrying the visible wounds of the previous night's battle, Jess Blackwood leaned forward in his seat with the intensity of a man who had found exactly what he'd been searching for. The auctioneer, a rotund man named Pettibone who spoke with the rehearsed enthusiasm of a carnival barker, gestured toward Jacob like a merchant displaying prized livestock. Gentlemen, what we have here is a prime specimen, 32 years of age, 6 foot 4 inches, approximately 240 pounds of pure muscle. Strong as an ox, perhaps stronger. Last night on the Terrell plantation, this buck fought 12 white overseers and remained standing. Now I know what you're thinking sounds like trouble. But think of it this way, that same strength that makes him dangerous also makes him invaluable. Imagine what he could do in your fields, your mills, your lumber operations. He paused for effect, suggests. The opening bid is $1,800. Hiram Blackwood raised his hand immediately. $2,000. A murmur rippled through the crowd. That was an extraordinary sum, more than most enslaved people would ever be worth. But Blackwood wasn't buying labor. He was buying a symbol, a challenge, an opportunity to prove that his methods could break even the strongest will. $2,000 going once. $2,500, another voice called. Blackwood's jaw tightened. $3,000. The bidding war lasted 7 minutes, a strange echo of the 7 minutes Jacob had fought the night before. By the time the gavel fell, suggests, Hiram Blackwood had paid $4,200 for the right to own Jacob Terrell, a sum so astronomical that even Edmund Terrell, who had come to collect his profit, raised his eyebrows in surprise. Suggests $4,000 was the price of a skilled blacksmith, a trained carpenter, a house servant fluent in French. It was not the price of a field hand, no matter how strong. But Blackwood wasn't paying for Jacob's labor. He was paying for the satisfaction of destroying what 12 men could not. Jests. For the ability to return to his turpentine camps and tell the other enslaved workers that he had purchased the legendary Jacob Terrell and reduced him to nothing. Pride in the economy of slavery had its own currency. Jests. Jacob stood on the auction block throughout the bidding, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the walls, beyond the river, beyond the world of men who believed they could buy and sell souls. He did not speak, did not plead, did not show fear or despair or resignation. His silence was its own form of defiance, a refusal to perform the brokenness they expected, the contrition they demanded. Jests. When Blackwood approached after the sale to inspect his purchase, walking around Jacob like a man evaluating a horse, checking his teeth, his muscles, the scars on his back, Jacob finally looked directly at him. Their eyes met. Jests. And what Blackwood saw there made him take an involuntary step backward. It was not hatred, though hatred would have been easier to understand and therefore easier to punish. It was something colder and more certain knowledge. Jacob knew what awaited him in the Alabama pine forests, knew that Blackwood would use every tool of violence and degradation to break him, knew that his chances of survival were slim, and his chances of escape even slimmer. Jests. But he also knew something Blackwood didn't, that some men can be killed but never broken, and that the difference between those two states was the only freedom left to him now. Jacob Terrell never returned to Louisiana. The records from Blackwood's turpentine operation, such as they were, list him only once. Negro male Jacob acquired December 1856, 4200, assigned to third-rank forest crew. After that, silence, no death record, no sale receipt, no notation of escape or transfer. He simply vanished into the pines of Alabama, into the brutal machinery of an industry that consumed enslaved laborers like fuel and kept no careful accounting of their death. Jests. Some whispered that he died within the first month, that Blackwood made an example of him, had him whipped to death in front of the other workers to establish his authority. Others claimed Jacob killed Blackwood with his bare hands one night and fled into the swamps, living as a fugitive until the Civil War freed him. Still others insisted he survived the turpentine camps, outlasted Blackwood himself, and lived to see emancipation in 1865, though no one could say for certain where he went or what name he took when he was finally free to choose one. But the truth of what happened to Jacob's body mattered less than what happened to his story. Within weeks of the fight, enslaved people across Louisiana were whispering about the man who fought 12 overseers. By spring of 1857, the story had spread to Mississippi, to Alabama, to Georgia, carried along the invisible networks of communication that connected quarters across the South, passed between field hands during cotton picking, between washerwomen at the river, between preachers at secret night gatherings. The details changed with each telling. In some versions, Jacob fought 20 men. In others, he broke his chains with his bare hands and walked away unharmed. In one particularly elaborate retelling, he transformed into a bear, then an eagle, then finally into wind itself, ungraspable and eternal. The facts dissolved into myth, but the essential truth remained. A black man had said no, had stood his ground, had fought an entire system with nothing but his body and his will, and for 7 impossible minutes he had won. Sarah Terrell gave birth in March of 1857 to a daughter. She named her Freedom, just as Jacob had asked, and when the child was old enough to understand language, Sarah told her about her father, not the sanitized version history might have preferred, but the true story with all its blood and beauty and impossible courage. Freedom grew up hearing about the night 12 white men could not bring down one black man, and she carried that story through the Civil War, through Reconstruction, through the long bitter years of Jim Crow. She told it to her own children, suggests, who told it to theirs, and each generation added their own verse to the song Jacob had sung in the darkness of the sugar mill. The broken cudgel Sarah had saved was passed down like a sacred relic, proof that the impossible had once happened, suggests that resistance, even doomed resistance, carved its mark into the world and refused to be erased. December 14, 1856 is not remembered in any official history. No monument marks the spot where Jacob Terrell stood his ground, jests. No textbook records the names of the 12 overseers who learned that chains can only hold a body, never a spirit. But in the quarters and the whispered histories that survived slavery and segregation and every attempt to silence them, jests, Jacob Terrell became something more than a man. He became proof that the mathematics of oppression, 12 against 1, armed against unarmed, system against individual, could be defied even if only for 7 minutes. Even if the cost was everything. His story lived in the spirituals sung in secret, in the quiet strength of people who refused to believe the lies told about their worth, in every act of resistance that said, "I am human, I am here," jests, and you will not break me. Some men leave behind monuments of stone. Jacob Terrell left behind something more enduring, the memory of a moment when one man stood between cruelty and the woman he loved, when strength became more than physical force, suggests when defiance transformed into legend. That memory still echoes, still matters, still reminds us that the fight for dignity is never truly lost, because even defeat, when faced with courage, becomes a kind of victory that no power on earth can take away.